Hello and welcome to another update. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, and then they'll be taking a closer look at the fronts to give a proper overview over the current situation. So starting out in the Robotyne direction, we see here that the Russians were pushed back to the main defensive line. The front line essentially looks like the main defensive line separating the Russian forces and the Ukrainian forces here to the east of Robotyne. The southern parts of Robotyne is still not under Ukrainian control. This is most likely due to the fortifications here to the south of Robotyne. As long as the Russians still hold on to them, the Ukrainians are unable to fully capture the village. Although Deep State map shows the whole village under Ukrainian control, there is no indication that the southern parts are still under their control. They have placed a flag at one of the buildings here in the southern parts, but that's about it. The latest videos we see of Russian forces launching strikes on Ukrainian forces all happen on the central and northern parts of the village. There's almost none at the southern parts, which would indicate that the southern parts are not under Ukrainian control. So the current situation here in the Robotyne front is that the Russian forces are essentially retreated across the main defensive line to the east. As for the south and west, they are still holding their defensive positions. So this is at any show of weakness by the Ukrainian side, the Russians will launch a counterattack into the village and try to retake it. So far, I hear from pro-Russian sources that they are actually present in the southern parts of the village. However, I've seen no evidence of that, so I'm still keeping that as a maybe. But what we do see is that they still held their trenches here to the south and west of the village, and that is why the Ukrainians are having difficulties actually holding on to the village and fully controlling the village. This is why we see them pushing eastwards and southeastwards and getting stuck by Robotyne since the alleged capture of the village. If the Ukrainians had full capture of the village, then we would see fighting at the southern parts of the trenches here to the south or to the west of the village, but we're mainly seeing fights by Robotyne and to the east of it, which would mean either that they do not have full control over it or they're focusing on the eastern parts. But then we see that the Ukrainian forces are actually moving southwestwards from this eastern part, which would indicate that the Ukrainian forces are here looking to bypass the fortifications the Russians are holding on to the north of Novoprokopivka, and this is why we're seeing them attack from the east. However, this allows the Russians to have direct fire on their positions from across the trench lines, so this is also an issue for the Ukrainian forces. The latest reports from this part of the front line shows that the Ukrainians are continuing gathering their forces and pushing towards the main defensive line of the Russian forces, but this is also showcasing that the Ukrainian forces are working through the fields, trying to move towards the main defensive line, while the Russian forces are sitting in their trenches, sitting in their defensive positions. So when the artillery duels begin and both sides launch heavy strikes on each other, the Russians having a firepower advantage, launching more on the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians are launching on the Russians, and the Russians being in defensive positions while the Ukrainians are out in the open, this would cause more casualties on the Ukrainian side. So the current situation is untenable for the Ukrainian forces. It is not a good position to be in, so they're most likely looking to change it as soon as possible. And the obvious choice is Verbove, as that is where there's the most possibility of actually breaking through. So the gap here between Verbove and the main defensive line, between the trenches and the anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, is likely some sort of invitation by the Russian forces for the Ukrainians to break through. However, this also gives the Ukrainians a better chance at breaking through than if they were to push here in the southern parts. So although it is likely a trap, it doesn't matter if it's a trap when it is the best place to break through nonetheless. So if the Ukrainians are to ever break through, they have to go through this quote-unquote trap. So we're seeing that the Ukrainians are likely to go through the Verbove area despite knowing it's a trap, because it is the best place to attack through. Then we move on to the Remevsky Ledge area. So here it's been much more silent. The Ukrainian forces are looking to push westwards and eastwards, as is seen by the latest updates. We see here that they have managed to push westwards and eastwards since the capture of Urushaina and Staromayorsk. They've also managed to push the Prirodne front further south, evening it out a bit more. However, here it seems that attacks have significantly decreased. We also see that the power balance is more heavily on the Russian side, so this is why we are hardly seeing any movement by the Ukrainians here. Now they are currently just staying here to keep the Russian forces here. That doesn't look like they are planning on any offensive operations. So from the very start, I criticized this area for the Ukrainians because the supply lines is terrible in this direction. If the Ukrainians manage to break through the main defensive line of the Russian forces in this direction, they'll still have a difficulty pushing through, even with no fortifications, due to the terrible supply lines in this area. However, it does seem like this was more of a diversion rather than anything else, and considering that this goes both ways, the Russian supplies here are also terrible due to the lack of roads and train tracks and so on going into the front line. This means that the Ukrainians have most likely tried to take advantage of that lack of supply to actually attrit the Russian forces in this part of the front line. So what we've seen is that the Ukrainian forces managed to capture Urushaina, and it has essentially stopped since then. However, we did receive reports during the Battle of Urushaina that the Russians were having some artillery supply issues, and this is most likely due to the bad supply routes, and as such they were able to capture the village. In comparison, the Robotyne area, it has been much easier for the Russians to resupply, and this is why we're seeing that it is much more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to it and capture it compared to the eastern parts here by Staromayorsk and Urushaina. But this doesn't mean that the Russians had nothing, as we've seen videos of heavy shelling in Urushaina after the Ukrainian capture of it. So most likely they have some areas by Seremenivka where they have ammo depots that they have just docked up on, and that they use them when the Ukrainians advance, when they think that they are most vulnerable, and as such they try to inflict as many casualties as possible. Then we move on to the Klishchiivka area, where here the Ukrainian forces are heavily focusing on Klishchiivka, but they're also having some focus here in the south by Andreevka. So what we've seen is that the Ukrainians have been pushing southeastwards from their positions here by Ivanivske and the canal line, and as such we've seen them advance in the direction of Andreevka and Klishchiivka. We've seen that their main focus have been to hold on to the fortifications here to the north of Klishchiivka, which gives them the high ground and a fortified position to attack on the Russian positions from, and as such they have been able to capture half the village. There has been no updates on the area since the last update, which showcased the capture of half the village on the 28th of August. Since then, there's been essentially no updates. We have seen that the Russian forces earlier on in this month managed to counterattack in this direction and recapture some positions. But since then, the Ukrainians then counterattacked again, and now they have positions further ahead than what they had previously. So the Ukrainian forces are putting a lot of forces in this direction. This is the area of the front where the Ukrainians have the highest concentration of troops, approximately 108,000 according to my analysis based on the open source data from militaryland.net. And as such, we see that the Ukrainian forces are heavily focusing on the Bakhmut area. It is something that they are, and the Russians as well, are heavily desperate about. There's no reasonable conclusion as to why both sides are fighting so heavily over this city, that the fighting continues over a year since it began. And it makes essentially no sense, as the strategic value of the city is significant, but not to the point that hundreds of thousands of troops fight over it every day. And finally, to the Luhansk, Svatove, Kreminna, Kupiansk front, we see that the Russian forces continue their attacks in two directions. The most important development here had been the capture of Novoselivsk by the Russian forces, after which they had the high grounds here to the south of the road, and they were able to relocate their forces here to Kislivka and Kotlyarivka. And at the same time, we've seen them do some pushes here to the north of the Kharkiv region, where they push towards Sinkivka and Petropavlivka. The focus here on the Russian side is to reach and cut off the supply line going east of the Oskli River line, east of Kupiansk, allowing them to capture positions here to the north of the region. However, we've seen so far that the Russians have been unable to capture the village of Sinkivka. This is most likely due to the heavy artillery battles going on between the two sides. Although the village has been left by the Ukrainian forces, there's still a lot of Ukrainian forces in the forest line as well as in the Kupiansk direction, launching artillery strikes and doing some ambushes against the Russian forces attempting to advance. And as such, we see that they are having a very difficult time trying to capture the village, and that they are focusing more on the eastern parts. We've seen that they have been focusing widely on the front line, and as such they're able to capture a lot of fortifications by the Ukrainian forces across, as the Ukrainian forces are having difficulty responding to the different advances by the Russian forces. However, now that they have the river line here by Petropavlivka, and that they as such have a shorter front to worry about, this allows them to then hold back the Russian forces better, and as such we've seen no Russian advances in this area since the 17th of August, which is 2 weeks ago. So this is essentially a stalemate right now, as neither side seems to be able to advance. The latest advance by the Russian forces was on the 28th of August, and as such they are not advancing in this part of the front, but they may very well soon capture the village due to the constant onslaught of the Russian forces in this direction, trying to push back the Ukrainian forces, inflicting some casualties and rightly receiving some as well, but they here have a numerical superiority over the Ukrainian forces, and as such they can take more casualties than them while they advance in the direction. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.